Death and incapacity aren't Canadian problems, they're universal. What differs by country and culture is how normalized the conversations are, how embedded planning is in healthcare and the legal system, and how supported families are when decisions have to be made. In our culture and many Western cultures like ours, most people avoid talking about death, about wills, and even about legacy, but doing so significantly reduces stress, strengthens relationships, and enhances flourishing in life right now. This stat nearly blew my mind. A 2025 Ipsos poll for RBC Insurance reported only 15% of Canadians have an estate plan. Let me translate that for you. If the other 85% die, the government divvies up their money, assets, and property. And it's true, there is a small investment needed to write wills and powers of attorney, but the price is just the excuse. The real barrier no one talks about is the misunderstanding that a responsible attitude about planning for death somehow invites it, when in reality, it's exactly the opposite. This episode explores why that's true, what's standing in the way, and how reframing mortality planning changes how we live, love, and invest our finite resources. And it would not be possible without the unique genius of Greg Barnsdale. So let's get to know Greg a little bit. Greg Barnsdale is a unique death doula. As a licensed funeral director, certified executor advisor, certified financial planner, certified grief coach, ghostwriter, and hospice volunteer, he brings a perspective shared by few others. He successfully published a well-received book, which is thought-provoking and engaging. Shortly after publication, however, Greg was diagnosed with a large brain tumor. Faced with prompt brain surgery or a death sentence, he emerged with a very compelling message. He stresses that estate planning helps alleviate the stress of aging, leaves survivors more financially and emotionally resilient, and increases the likelihood of harmony, reduces the risk of contesting final wishes. More meaningful legacies and greater social capital often result. Immense pressure is alleviated from the courts, and cumulatively, the economy benefits. It's a massive win for everyone. He has almost 14,000 followers on LinkedIn and has been a guest on several podcasts worldwide. Greg is on a mission to inspire others to speak with loved ones about their end-of-life wishes, while minds are clear and time is plentiful. Although these conversations can be difficult to have, believe me, I've been a part of many of them with my clients. They are far better than not having them, because I've been part of those conversations too, when those conversations didn't happen before the end of life. Greg stresses that aside from leaving our loved ones with financial security, leaving them with proper end-of-life direction is the ultimate gift of love. Greg Barnsdale, welcome to the Flourish Feed podcast.
Thank you, Gillian. I appreciate being part of your program.
Now, you sit at this rare intersection, which fascinates me, the intersection of death care and financial planning. What's the most common avoidance pattern that you see across families, regardless of maybe income or culture?
Well, Gillian, it's primarily a reluctance to talk about these things. And I think that there are a number of reasons why so many people are reluctant to talk about end-of-life issues. I think in many cases, it comes down to perhaps a superstition that, as you had just indicated, some people feel it could bring death on sooner, which really I certainly don't believe in that. I don't think anyone working in death care typically would believe in that, but in some cases it could be a fear of death, or it could be many other reasons, such as not even knowing where to turn or being overwhelmed by the overall topic in general, because it can be very complex.
You're absolutely right. And I mean, when somebody dies or becomes incapacitated without an estate plan, like that first period of time for the family where they're already exhausted, they're already in a state of grief, and maybe they've had decision fatigue just getting to that point. What does that leave them with? What does that leave them with as a next step?
Well, in some cases, it leaves just a big void of uncertainty and not knowing where to turn. Having our final affairs in order gives valuable direction to those that we love most. And if we're not willing or able to lean into these types of planning opportunities, well, the opportunities exist. We're just leaving our loved ones in a position of great difficulty, and it can be avoided just simply by being proactive.
And the difficulty, you know, we've pointed out is emotional, and it's definitely relational. I've definitely been part of several family instances where a lack of information created a rift, and then that rift really never healed. But there's also a financial cost to this. So what's the most expensive part of poor planning that most people never price in your experience, either as a funeral director or maybe later in financial advice?
Well, one of them that comes to mind that relates directly to your role, Gillian, is the aspect of taxation. As you and I know all too well, the tax planning opportunities basically disappear when someone dies. And yet when someone is alive, there are all kinds of different tax planning strategies that can effectively be put in place legitimately. And you know, the Canadian government allows us to do this, but we have to, again, get good advice and be proactive. That's really the whole secret and solution to so much of the turmoil is being proactive and doing things right with good advice.
You're absolutely right. And we're going to get back to the advice piece in a minute, because I do believe we sit at a moment where advice is becoming harder and harder to come by because of the disparity in income levels and in asset levels. We'll return to that. But in your book, which we've got, if you're watching this on the visual podcast, you can see the cover of Greg's book in his background, but I'm also going to throw a B-roll slideshot of that in here. Do Not Ignore Your Mortality is the name of this book. It positions this whole planning experience as both practical and human. So what's the real definition of planning well in the terms that you introduce in Do Not Ignore Your Mortality?
Well, it's a situation, Gillian, that is created out of open communication and a willingness to engage the family members that should be involved, the closest people that we care about, by bringing them into these types of intimate, deep, meaningful conversations about one's legacy and the purpose of one's life, and then taking the proper steps to plan everything from the potential of an incapacity to a death and everything in between that accomplishes that person's goals and objectives with what they want to see happen long term.
And I think that kind of puts what do you call it? It hits the nail on the head about the goals and objectives, because those are big, scary topics. And now as we talked about before we started today, we're living through a period of post-retirement that is becoming longer and longer. And I'm sure you've known people through maybe your work as an advisor, as I have, who seem to become obsessed with it. And then they can't stop thinking about it. But just as equally, there are people who refuse to think about it. So first of all, what happens when we look at that chapter of life and we objectify the conversation such that we can hit these 5 to 7 topics that really, really matter? What's possible then for the testator, which is the person writing the will, the person writing the documents? What's possible, and what might be some of examples of those goals and objectives? Like, give us some language that people can think about, because I think there's a lack of clear lexicon and terms around this.
Well, I think to a large degree, most of us want to set up our children in the best possible financial situation that we can, and also ensure that they will have the financial security and the wherewithal to basically create a good life for themselves, to be independent and achieve their goals and objectives based on what they want, not to necessarily hand them a silver platter so that they can go off and perhaps do things that they shouldn't. But it really comes down to personal choice and the goals and objectives, as you said, Gillian, of that testator, but in some real particular terms of what people are looking for. It could be as well donating to a particular hospital. It could be helping their children out to purchase a home, or to establish a business, or to do any number of different things like that. But that's where the conversations with professional advisors, such as a good financial advisor and a good lawyer, to bring out these types of ideas that need to be well planned for.
You're absolutely right. When I think about, this is where I'm going to have to write down the time because I had a thought and now it's gone. Let's go back to, when I think about what's possible here, it does require a little bit of communication skills on the part of the advisor or the facilitator, because what we're asking people to do is imagine the day that they don't wake up, is to imagine what life looks like when they're no longer here. It's hard enough for people to imagine next week or next year, let alone that. But through that imagination exercise, when we can have the conversation about what do you want there to be for your children, what legacy or what impression do you want to have left on a charity that you really care about? I mean, in your work, maybe as a planner, have you come up with a key set of questions that need to be part of that discussion? Because I think it's that process of imagining that can unlock the door. If we access it through the tax conversation, that might attract a certain number of people to become excited or concerned about it. But maybe there's just as many people who need to have their imaginations ignited in a positive way. Oh my gosh, how do you do that?
Well, you're right, Gillian. It's difficult because this whole topic of death is what most people want to avoid and not even think about it at all. So trying to get them to think about the time when they are gone is not easy. But you're right, it has to be as inspiring as possible to attract that engagement from these people that should be more proactive. And that's why in the bio that I had provided to you about trying to make this whole topic a little more inspiring to people about creating more resilience for their family and helping charities and helping the economy and so on. That's where I was attempting to make this as inspiring as I can. But you're right, the language that advisors can learn to use can be incredibly effective in helping get those conversations going more effectively. And on my website, under the More section and under the Resources section are a couple of documents. One is the Probing Legacy Questions that I have curated, a list of questions to help anyone have more effective conversations with those that they love and care about. And advisors can easily use these too. 15 are positioned for more basic conversations, and another 15 are curated for more advanced types of conversations.
That's brilliant. I will make sure there is a link to that list of probing questions, because what you're speaking to is getting to a level of detail that can disable the fear and engage the goal setting or goal achieving mindset. With the level of detail around taxes and what's left on the table, I think when you start to put it in those terms, all of a sudden people wake up. When you talk about the positive aspects of the legacy you can leave behind to help your children or to help a charity, and you start to walk it out with an imagination, now we're getting into the details. What you've also just talked about there, which we mentioned in your bio as well, are the details of the energy and time and stress that could remain and the economic ripple effect of doing it well. Do you have any numbers around the economic ripple effect of what's at stake or what's possible or what's going right or wrong with this process right now?
I don't, Gillian, and that's something that I have not attempted to calculate. But I can imagine it is massive, and just think if more people had a valid and current will and didn't need to involve the legal system in regards to litigation to solve the dispute battles over settling an estate, and more charities ended up being helped through creating more social capital through all of the advantages of tax planning and planned giving, the world would be a better place.
You're right, because there'd be so much less energy and money sink into the things that are dragging us down, and much more energy and money release to the things that obviously the testator does care about, but they're not really feeling at liberty necessarily to get it out there. So let's imagine now that our listeners have believed us. They've said, all right, fine. You know what? I will do something about this. What's the minimum good enough? The sort of the minimum table stakes that someone should have to not be part of that 15% statistic I read at the beginning about the Ipsos Reid poll. What's the minimum?
I was thinking about this point not too long ago, Gillian, and I truly do think that minimum bar should be having a current and valid will and a current and valid power of attorney. And you know, you had asked me when we were speaking off screen about what's one of the most compelling questions to ask people. And what I have found in my experience is to simply ask them, do you have a current and valid will? And it seems to stop people dead in their tracks.
Literally, yeah.
But they almost seem to be, you know, like a deer in the headlights, so to speak, because they know to a large degree they should have this in place.
And obviously the fear tactic And it doesn't surprise me, but the fear tactic doesn't work. You can't scare people into getting a will. I know you can have a triggering event like you did. You can have a triggering event where you lose a loved one and it doesn't go well, and all of a sudden you come to religion and you get yourself a will. But now we got to build this bridge to, I think we need to build this bridge between where people are when they become that deer in the headlights and how they get to the 80% good enough status of, okay, I have a will. Now, there's two ways they can go. If they're people who are fortunate to work with an advisor personally, that's a conversation that every advisor wants to have and tries to have, but many people don't. But there's a great number of people in this country that don't have access to an advisor. What's the route that they can take in order to get to that good enough place of having a valid will and power of attorney?
Well, the route is simply doing it online, Gillian, but there are cautions with that. And coming through the COVID pandemic, that changed the whole atmosphere, the whole landscape in regards to so many things, and will planning being one of them. But there are so many different platforms available now that anyone can set up an online will rather easily and inexpensively. But it's so vitally important to make sure that will planning platform does provide some type of legal type of guidance, because the resulting document, it's crucial that resulting document be accepted by the the court in the jurisdiction where the deceased lived. But again, there are cautions. If someone is paying child support, they should be seeing a lawyer and not setting up a will online. Or if they own any part of a business, or they have a disabled child, or any more complex issues like that, a lawyer should be involved.
You're absolutely right. I mean, there are more and more. There are these online tools. And in my 20 odd years experience as an advisor, when you sit on this side of the table with estate planning people and lawyers, they say, oh, no, don't use those for all those reasons that you just mentioned. There could be a complicating factor. We could be establishing a will in the wrong jurisdiction or not sensitive to assets that might be in another jurisdiction. But in many cases, we could make a big dent in that 85% of people who don't have a will by using these online tools. So I will make sure in the show notes that we mention a couple of these really powerful Canadian tools that are endorsed for more simple situations, not like the ones you mentioned. I want to turn to the multiplier effect, not necessarily the economic one, because I'm going to try and find some numbers when I write about you to try and describe that, but talk about the multiplier effect on the other forms of capital. Let's start with time. So where do families lose the most time when planning is poor? In your experience, either as a funeral director or as a financial advisor or both, where's the greatest time suck? How does it happen?
Well, depending on the situation, Gillian, it can be a time factor in regards to wasted time in disputes with family members over what was to take place because the planning was not done thoroughly enough or not done at all. The time factor could also certainly play into the aspect of the estate being settled. If the planning is not done and a will is not in place and basically the family does not know what is to be done, it can just draw out the process over a very long period of time. And again, that creates so much more stress. I have heard from someone not long ago that settling an estate is like a bureaucratic ultra marathon was the way that it was put. And I think that's a very good way to explain it.
You're right. And I often think, hey, it would be so great if we could simplify the tax system in this country and in other countries to make it more streamlined. And I think the estate settlement process could also be a little bit more streamlined. There's so many little tick boxes that need to happen there. But when you don't have the will, just to put this in numerical context, even with an estate of, let's say, $100,000, that $100,000, if it gets held up in the courts without a will for a year or 2 years or 3 years, let's say that money could have actually been in the hands of the people who it was left to, and they might have used it or invested it. At a minimum, on that $100,000 alone, we're leaving $5,000 to $6,000 a year on the table. And there's the cost of the litigation itself, because now getting it through the courts without a will, there's going to be a lawyer who takes some of that $100,000. So it's a massive swing, even on something just using the $100,000 example. When we now look at the energy side of things, because we've talked about the complicating factor with time, and we've talked about how, an example with money, but then you throw grief into the mix, which is a massive energy taker as well. What does that look like when you pair it with administrative chaos? I mean, talk about a bureaucratic ultramarathon. Now it's a bureaucratic ultramarathon trying to do like a Greek tragedy at the same time. So what's the difference when a family can simply follow instructions that are left behind compared to grief in the circumstances with no will?
Well, in so many cases, Gillian, I think that many people end up going down the road of complicated grief. And losing someone is one of the most challenging things that any of us can face, yet it is so prevalent. We all have to go through this. But many people have to, well, let me back up. Many people end up suffering from complicated grief because of many different factors. And I certainly feel that if an estate is not structured properly and well thought out, it can certainly lead to complicated grief for the survivors in some cases. And it just makes things much, much worse versus a situation where someone has a more natural, healthy grieving process.
Yeah.
And that makes a massive difference.
That really touches on your experience as a grief counselor and somebody who has worked with the terminology around grief. But when I even as not a grief counselor, I think about it in very simple terms. If you remove these extra decision points of what if, or what did they mean, or what should happen, or how do we do this, and you simply allow yourself to go through the very human process of loss without all of those extra friction points, that's how you get to complicated grief. I'm imagining is something to do with that, because now you're throwing in all of these extra inflammatory factors of conflict with the other person, maybe not having the same viewpoint as you, or having to deal with a system that seems to be slow and misguiding sometimes. So this brings me to this question about a contrasting pair. So what happens when someone plans well versus what happens when they don't? And we've talked about it through time and energy and money, but I want to dig a little further into your experience as a grief counselor. What happens when someone plans well in terms of the complicated grief versus the uncomplicated grief? Do you have any case examples of a family in each scenario where you can look back and you can go, that was well done, or that could have been done better?
Yeah, I can think of situations, Gillian, where in some cases grieving surviving family members ended up needing long-term counseling to get through the ordeal when it was not structured well, and in some cases had health problems as a result, compared to other situations which were just much more easier for them to get through. Although it was still difficult to lose someone in their family that they loved and cared about, it was just generally easier to get through, and it was much more of a natural type of process to get through that grieving process.
Yeah. I mean, it sounds like in more ways than one, good planning is truly transferring wealth, not just in the money sense, but also in the permission to go through a very human experience the most natural way. And in the other case, it's kind of a leak, right? You're leaking not just the money and the time at the time of the death, but maybe for many years after. So now let's go and look a little bit more global, because I know many of your 14,000 followers on LinkedIn are not from Canada. They're from many other cultures out there. And this brings us to the topic of normalizing that Canada is not alone, but there's actually some countries out there that are doing it differently and well. And it's not because the individuals are smarter or better or more motivated. It's maybe because the system is set up. So I would like you to talk to us about what you notice culturally about places where death planning is more normalized. What do they do differently? Is it systems? Is it rituals? Is it all the above? Give me some examples.
Yeah, it is basically all of the above, Gillian, and I have looked at some of those, many of those links as well. Some of the links that you and I were referring to earlier were to a large degree talking about the end-of-life care from a health perspective in hospice care and those sorts of things. So that certainly relates to the aspect of how society sets up its medical care for people who are dying. And I know from my research in creating the manuscript for my book and becoming a hospice volunteer myself, there is such a significant need for people to step up and become hospice volunteers. I know that Canada is certainly not leading in this regard, and we need to be doing better within this country. But it really just comes down to having more of a willingness to lean into these things and seek out good advice and to plan properly. And I guess have more of a mortality mindset around these sorts of things. We're all going to die. Why not just accept it, or be more accepting of it, and plan accordingly, and then update our plans as time goes by, and move forward, enjoy life. Because I think that helps us do just that.
You're absolutely right. And I mean, you, like myself, I won't say we're on the back half of the back nine of life or the second half, but we are. And I mean, I have my own rituals around when I relook at my estate plan, when I update or even remind myself sometimes what the particulars were in my wills or my insurance policies. Walking it out yourself, what's your ritual around it? Do you look at it every year? Because the other thing that I mentioned earlier that I see is some people become so obsessed with it, that's all they focus on, and then that's all we ever do. And I feel like that's an imbalance as well. So what's a healthy ritual around when you look at this to keep it updated?
Yes, I do try to look at it every year. I know some people try to do it around their birthday, Gillian, and I don't know if there's a perfect time. Not too long ago, I was suggesting to people to talk about these things when families gather at Christmas. And then I got speaking to somebody who said, well, Greg, maybe that's really not the best time to be discussing these end-of-life issues because it is Christmas. So I don't really know, Gillian, if there's a perfect time to be doing this, but certainly having that mortality mindset is vitally important. Another aspect of my message that we haven't discussed yet, but end-of-life planning should not be done at the end of life. When I came back to the funeral industry briefly after being a financial advisor, and I'm still a certified financial planner today, although I'm not working in that role, I'm promoting my book on a full-time basis. But when I came back to the funeral business for a short period of time, I worked at what I believe is the largest mortuary in Canada, and they are involved in over 100 deaths per day. And many people, Gillian, have a hard time getting their head around that, but it is very true. I've worked on the front lines of death care with forensics personnel and medical examiners and the police and so on. And I've seen situations that most people, I don't think, could even imagine. But death is really all around us. Many people are simply just tuned out. And that's why it's important for people to have their will, their power of attorney, and talk to their family members about what they want to have happen, even when they're young adults. Because it can happen, death can happen to any of us, or incapacity at any age. Look what I've gone through with this brain tumor. I wasn't expecting this.
No.
But one of the toughest questions, one of the toughest things that I have experienced as a funeral director is asking families at the time of a death, what did your loved one want to have happen? Did they want to be buried? Did they want to be cremated? Those sorts of very basic, that type of fundamental question. And the numbers of times, Gillian, that the family members had no idea what the deceased wanted shocked me.
I can believe that. And that would be the very first question, and you get to ask it, that could cause doubt, uncertainty, fear, all of the retreating mechanisms that cause families to start having trouble instead of being able to move forward. You mentioned a moment ago and reminded me that we both hold a designation, Certified Executor Advisor. And I think there's an interesting piece that I'm going a little off script here, but I'm pretty sure we can do it, that there isn't really a lot of training or education out there when you name somebody as your executor. And I wonder what your thoughts were around either executor education in Canada, how people might step up to do that role, what's available, and are there other countries that are arming their executors differently that allows this to be a little bit easier? Because if it's administered easily, if there is a will, if the estate is administered a little more easily and the executor happens to be a family member, maybe that's another release valve, to know that things were done well. Talk to me a little bit about your knowledge of executor education.
Well, that's a topic that I strategically wanted to discuss within my book, because I strongly felt, especially as a certified executor advisor as you are, Gillian, and I wrote part of the curriculum for the CICEA, the funeral planning chapter, by the way.
That's where I knew you from.
But you're exactly right. The whole aspect of estate literacy needs to be increased. Financial literacy, as you know, is slowly increasing, and our industry, I think, is doing a relatively good job at that. but the whole aspect of estate literacy really lags, and it needs to be improved dramatically. But in my book, I strategically and openly wanted to explain all of these primary aspects of what an executor does and the risks of becoming an executor, the risk of being sued as an example. And also at the back of the book, I have a detailed glossary from both industries, the funeral and the financial industry, that many people have told me is very well put together. But that's really the whole premise of what I've curated in this book, is to give people at least a basic working knowledge of what they should at least know at a minimum, and inspire them to move forward to get some planning done.
That's brilliant. I like the glossary idea. I think that's so helpful because in this world where, a lot of information is flooded at us all the time, and it can trigger a lot of feelings when we don't understand what the words are. If we can have a clear dictionary of what these really powerful words are, we can feel a little bit more empowered as we take some of these steps. So in, winding towards a bit of a closing here, if someone listening to this does one thing this week, let's imagine that they are one of those 85% that doesn't have the will. Let's start with those people. If there's one thing they could do this week, what might it be so that they begin down the road of becoming the 15%?
Well, this is going to sound very biased, but I'm going to say honestly, Gillian, reading or listening to my book will give them that basic knowledge of what they should know. There's a bit of humor in it. I work in some humor based on my coach who was a dragon for 3 seasons.
Wow.
So I've created this very strategically, and I also took this dragon's advice and recruited over 25 people from my target market to provide me feedback as I created it. And these people provided me excellent feedback based on what they had experienced in their lives about how they wanted to make it easier for other people. But it truly is a book that I think will inspire people to get planning and not leave these things, and get talking with their family about really what they want to have happen.
What a great process you undertook there. You had great mentorship and leadership in something you already knew a lot about, but as a writer, brilliant, number one. 2, engaging people who are in your network to give you their firsthand stories to enrich what it is that you were talking about as a professional. Guys, we got to look at this book. We got to listen to this book, because I think you're absolutely right. That does sound like the very first most important thing somebody could do this week. And hopefully it truly does inspire. Last question before I move to my closing question for the podcast. Finish this sentence. Handling mortality planning well gives your family the gift of
love. And that's really what all this is about, right? Our legacy and the purpose of our life, and making a difference, and making sure that when we're no longer here, that we have made our mark on the world. It really all comes down to, I think, to a large degree, love.
I love it. I love it. And I think that is a better motivating force than fear. And I think that is a great way to move forward, no matter where you're at in your estate planning journey. Now, each week on the Flourish Feed podcast, I ask the guest the very same closing question. It was designed, it still is, to help me, my kids, my clients, my friends, my family, and all of our listeners enjoy as many of their 1,440 minutes that they have each day. And it's something called the moment of bliss. So when you look at your day each morning, or you look back on your week at the end of each week, what's something small that happens for you that just instantly melts your heart or lights you up?
Well, ever since being diagnosed with a non-cancerous brain tumor 3 years ago, 2 months after I published this book, Gillian, I am incredibly grateful that it was not cancerous. And that's one of the things that lights me up. I still have an opportunity, even though my eye doesn't blink properly, and I got to put in eye drops and put up with a side of my face that hopefully will start to react a little better. I feel incredibly lucky.
Very good. Gratitude is Greg's moment of bliss, and it pays it forward and it multiplies, just like all of your great advice. Greg, thank you so much for giving voice to what we have to gain from increasing our strength in the system of our mortality planning. I wish you the most wonderful day. Thank you so much.
Thank you.